All right. Well, good morning, everybody. And already the 18th of September. I'm not September. I 18th of August as we get ready to roll into September. So that was a little wishful thinking on my part, but I hope by the 18th of September, maybe the temperatures are a little less than they are right now. Say again? So six here. I hope not. I'm already excited for 68. Anything that's below my air conditioning temperature would be a welcome relief to my house. So, yes, maybe the pool would give off some heat and then you could swim in it again. So we are on page 391 on authorship. And so with that, like all Paul's writing, Romans opens with a claim of Pauline authorship. So it says no critics have presented satisfactory reason to reject the claim. And in 1620, in verse 6, chapter 1622, Tertullus identified himself as the scribe or the amanuensis for the letter, and the content and the Pauline traits of the letter make it unlikely that Tertius selected his own words for the writing. So he served as more of a secretary recording the words rather than a creative editor expressing Pauline's ideas. So that's important to remember, the difference between somebody writing down what you're saying and then, or the difference between somebody hearing what you're saying and writing down what they think you mean. So that would be different. So here he is a secretary recording the works rather than an editor that says, well, this is what Paul means and I'll write it this way. And says the letter's obvious Pauline traits make one of the brief, which I know I'm pronouncing wrong, and support for an author other than Paul has little acceptance. So that word we covered, anybody remember what it meant? Yeah. It's in the back and it was covered on page 364, several months ago. What it means is the author is not disputed. And so that is the author of the book is not disputed. So just as the authorship of Romans is relatively uncontested, circumstances for the writing of the book are generally quite clear. And so Paul's description of his activities in Romans 15:23-29 suggests that he had completed the collection of funds for Jerusalem believers. His plan was to take the money to Jerusalem. These facts suggest that Paul wrote the Romans after 2 Corinthians, for the collection of the funds was still anticipated in 2 Corinthians when it was written. See 2 Corinthians 8-9. So that is good because that's a good idea to keep in mind. So when we read the New Testament letters, they weren't, they are by several different authors, but they're all inspired Word of God, and they give you also a chronological story in some instances. So when we read it, and as you read the different chapters and the different books, then these facts should start coming to light, right? That, in 2 Corinthians, he's still waiting for the funds, and in Romans, he's talking about going with the funds. So that is it's a good idea to, as you read the whole New Testament, you should start seeing relationships with events that are in the New Testament. And so Paul most noticed it was. Okay, good. For those of you who missed a few minutes, I'm not sure how much, we're still on 391 and we're on under the date and provenance. So in Gaul, who sent greetings in 1623, maybe the same person mentioned in 1 Corinthians 1:14. Now remember it could be the same person, right? And how many people had the name of Gaul? Probably a lot. And so since we don't call him Gaul of the city or Gaul that I previously did this with or that, then it may be the same person, but it's not explicit that it has to be the same person. The Gaul mentioned in the Corinth letter was certainly a resident of Corinth. The Erastus mentioned as the director of public works in 1623 may be once again the same person mentioned on the inscription found in Corinth. The Corinthian inscription concerned an Erastus who served as an aedile in Corinth and laid a section of the pavement at his own expense. Now, what does that word mean? We're going to talk about, we have questions of who the guy is. Some suggest that the term aedile was a Latin name for a commissioner of public works, but the identification is uncertain. So there's just, in trying to go beyond the message of the text is difficult if you try and focus on some of the people mentioned in the text, because the text isn't about them. So, but the original readers, it would have been evident, because otherwise it would, you write a letter and you say, yeah, I met with Rob and we did this and this and this, and 2,000 years later, we're like, yeah, who is Rob? Rob of where? And so it just gets a little, right, because the letter wouldn't have been, if you wrote it, it would mention Rob because we're acknowledging he was there, but the actual content of the message, just like this, is not about that. So we have adequate information for accepting the Corinthian origin of Romans, even if we do not identify Erastus mentioned in Romans with the man memorialized in the Corinthian inscription. So, there's still no doubt on the author of the book and the content. So the composition of the Roman church. Now this is it. When you read it, you're going to see that it addresses several, two groups of people, right? So as we look at this, we'll asking, well, who is it to? Is it to this group or is it to that group? Well, we'll see in reality, it's to both groups, right? It's just he's calling out some traits on this group. What are you guys doing? What are you thinking? He calls out some on the other group. What are you doing? And then we see it is a whole, what are you collectively doing? So did Paul write chiefly to the Jews or Gentiles and Romans? And that's what we're going to see. No, it wasn't just to the Jews or the Gentiles. Evidence from the book indicates that Paul indeed was writing to some Jews. His arguments in chapters 9 to 11 presupposes the importance of Jewish people in the divine plan, and in many passages he appears to argue against Jewish objections. So if he knew the objections, they made it to him, they came to him, he's aware of them, then there's where we would argue against these Jewish practices to a Jewish audience. Although his use of the example of Abraham in chapter 4 and his frequent references to the Old Testament would have more appeal to a predominantly Jewish congregation. So if we're brand new Christians, just like today, when we have brand new Christians, we have a lot of Christian talk, right? We have, we're believers filled with the Spirit. Well, we have all of these Christian words, right? So new Christians have to develop a new vocabulary. And in developing a new vocabulary, they need to know, well, what does that mean when they say it? So and just like today, the thing is, not wanting to stay live. If if we talk to new Christians and we start off with talking about, you know, we had Adam and then sin and then Christ, we have salvation, the new Adam, and then we talk about faith of Abraham and that. And like I've never read the Old Testament, right? What are we? Can you explain what's going on? So if you were a Gentile and a new Christian, and some of this letter, you would need some background. You'd need somebody to go, okay, that's who these people are, right? So that's why it makes more sense that in addressing these predominantly Jewish ideas that are in the Old Testament, that there would have to be some Jews there that really understood it. So on the other hand, so now we've addressed some of that Jews questions. Many passages in Romans suggest that the congregation was predominantly Gentile. Specifically, his reference in chapter 1, 5-6, and 1:13 and 15 to 16 single out Gentiles in the congregation and leave the impression that they comprised a major segment of the church. So in chapter 11, 28 to 31, the unbelief of the Jews brought God's mercy to the Gentiles, and Paul's statement in 11:13 indicate that he was focusing on this element of the ministry. So then we go to, although a substantial number of Jews were living in Rome, it seems, right, because he doesn't say 58% of you are Gentile, and so that's not the content of the letter, but it would make sense. That's why it seems likely that the congregation consisted of a Gentile majority and a strong Jewish minority. And so those people coming in, if you also had Jews, now remember at this time, they're receiving a letter, right? They did not receive the book of the New Testament. They received a letter. And so we're very fortunate we have the entire New Testament in which we can base our understanding of salvation, what it means to work out your faith, what it means to be a Christian, the expectations. So at this point, the only real book they have to go back to is the Old Testament, and they know the message that Paul gave them on what it meant for this when the Messiah came, and how the Messiah fulfilled the Old Testament, and how does that affect us today. Okay, there's no sacrificial system because all the sins are paid for, right? So we don't stop sacrificing animals. The sacrifice is done. And now it is, you don't have to be circumcised, right? You're not becoming a Jew. You're going right to, I'm a Christian. And then they talk, other verses talk about exactly that. You don't become a Jew first, and then you transition into Christianity. So, so as you read these letters, we have to keep in mind also how fortunate we are today that we have the whole book, and they don't yet. But they have apostles who are writing to them. Purpose. Some New Testament writing contains a clear statement of purpose. See John 20:30-31. But the purpose of many books in the New Testament must be deduced from their contents. Both of these approaches are useful in determining the purpose of Romans. So what we're going to see when we read through this is there wasn't just one purpose for the letter. It wasn't do this and here's why. He's addressing several issues, and in doing so, the purpose is broad. It's educating the congregation, but we'll see what the content here talks about. Paul stated that his longtime desire to visit Rome, but circumstances had prevented the fulfillment of that desire. He shared with the Romans his intention to come to them as he traveled through Rome to Spain. One intent of the letter was to seek the full cooperation of the Romans for this projected mission to Spain. He was hoping for financial support. See Romans 15:24 and 28. So as he expresses his desire to go there, he's also going to go there with an expectation that as a body of believers, that he oh my goodness. It's not, it is